Hello, everyone, and welcome to GLR Week 2023. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I am excited to be the webinar producer for our session today. Before we get started, I want to encourage all of you to connect and engage with us on social media. On Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third, and on Facebook and LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag GLRweek and hashtag bright spots silver linings to share any thoughts you may have. I'd also like to share some housekeeping tips before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and panelist bios will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered for this session. Lastly, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Again, it is my honor to welcome you to GLR Week 2023, where the theme has been bright spots and silver linings. Throughout the week, we've hosted numerous sessions, starting off with a public television session on gratitude and appreciation, followed by a governor's conversation that same day at 3 p.m. We also looked into different subjects such as being locked out of literacy, causes, consequences, and costs, as well as AI-enhanced efficacy, and many more. All of these sessions, as well as their materials, recordings, and panelist bios, are posted on our GLR Week 2023 microsite. That link will be posted in the chat box now, and we encourage you to take a look at those recordings and materials to see what you may have missed out on. And also wanted to promote our state event website, where we've been highlighting different states across the US and all of the events that they have been planning and hosting either on a virtual platform or in person. That specific website will also be posted in the chat box, and we encourage you to check it out. And come August, we are going to be taking a brief break from our GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars, but we will be hosting a number of exciting special rebroadcast sessions. You can see the lineup here, and information will be posted in the chat box now as how to register and where to watch these special rebroadcasts. And joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Hello to everyone joining us for today's GLR Week 2023 session, Global Perspectives on Post-Pandemic Academic Recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic has had devastating effects on learning in the United States and throughout the world, stranding more children on the wrong side of an even larger gap. When schools, early childhood programs, and childcare centers shifted to remote learning in early 2020, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading quickly pivoted to inform and activate our core constituencies, namely community coalition leaders, state and local funders, and program partners around the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge, in line with our ongoing commitment to early school success for children in economically challenged families. These efforts focused on slowing and stopping the devastating learning loss, closely following data to understand and communicate what children were experiencing. As part of our efforts to accelerate equitable learning recovery, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading has worked to lift up bright spot innovations for replication and scaling and encourage smart investments in digital equity, high dosage tutoring, professional development, and coaching for teachers, education technology, and learning happens everywhere approaches. To date, the exploration for innovations and smart investments has largely focused on what was happening inside the United States. But because the pandemic was a global phenomenon, we realized that innovative responses have and continue to emerge across the globe, and that a deeper exploration of those efforts can inform strategies to better support the children most affected by pandemic-precipitated learning loss. Today, we will hear from speakers about exciting science-backed initiatives happening in places like India, Africa, Europe, and South America. as we continue to look for ways to combat academic loss. The work of this session's speakers and their organizations gives us the opportunity to learn about, discuss, and be inspired to continue innovating in the United States. I will now turn it over to our moderator, a familiar face for many of you, John Gompertz, Executive Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hattie. And thanks and welcome to everybody who's joining. This is towards the end of a very long week of sessions, and we are thrilled that you have made the effort to join us today. And I think you'll enjoy this conversation and find it interesting, provocative, and maybe open your eyes a little to some new possibilities. We have a wonderful panel of guests with us today. So I'm going to just start by quickly introducing people, and then we are going to get little introductions to what their work is and what they're doing. And then we'll get into this conversation. So we have Catherine Begley, who's the Director of Technical Support, Education, and Adolescent Empowerment at CARE USA. We have Bridge Kothari, the founder of Planet Read and the co-lead of Billion Readers, which the acronym is BIRD. And we have former Governor Bob Wise, who is also now a leader at the Global Science of Learning and Education Network, which we're going to learn a whole bunch more about. And we have our old friend, Monroe Richardson, who's the Executive Director of Read Charlotte with us. And I think Monroe is billboarded as being like a commenter. Monroe's going to be part of this conversation. That's what I'm telling you. We're going to call on Monroe. Monroe's going to have questions and comments throughout. So welcome to all of our guests. Thanks so much for being with us today. And now I'd like to ask each speaker briefly, just to give the audience a little sense of what you're doing, what you and your organization are doing in this space. And Bob, why don't we go ahead and start with you? Tell us a little bit about GSOLN.
So the Global Science of Learning Education Network, or GSOLN, is a network of roughly currently 700 researchers, science of learning researchers across the world. We focus on, our goal is to move the science of learning rapidly into the decision-making that's occurring across the world by both practitioners, teachers, education leaders, and policymakers, to make sure that the best science of learning is informing the decisions that are being made. And of course, part of that is the science of reading. And that's what I'm excited to be here to talk about today.
Fantastic, Bob. Thanks so much. And folks have probably encountered Bob Wise sometime in his travels as a leader in Congress, as the governor of West Virginia, two-time governor of West Virginia, and a spectacular leader in the world of education reform, and digital education. Really fantastic to have you with us today, Bob. Thanks for making the time. Catherine Begley is from CARE USA, and I think we probably think mostly about CARE as a disaster response and international aid organization, but in fact, CARE is deeply invested in education development across the globe. And Catherine, you're part of that team. I'd love to hear just a little bit about what CARE does in the world of education.
Thank you, John. CARE stands for Cooperative Assistance and Relief Everywhere, and we work with country offices, CARE member partners, governments, local partners, and communities to implement education and adolescent empowerment programming in over 30 countries around the globe. The programming focuses on everything from early childhood development, early childhood education, through higher education and adult education interventions. We implement projects in developing countries and in countries experiencing multiple crises, whether they're related to political instability or economic downturn, to the ravages of climate change and extreme weather events. Our aim is to reach over 3 million children and adolescents every year, and we receive funding from a wide range of donors, including US government donors. We prioritized reaching adolescents, particularly girls, between the ages of 10 and 19. But we do also include in some of our programming interventions to support children between the ages of 0 through 9 and youth between the ages of 15 and 24, as well as men and boys. I do want to stress that much of our work is targeting marginalized communities around the globe in very hard to reach areas of the world where there is no electricity or basic services. And these marginalized groups include children with disabilities, children from religious, ethnic, caste, and tribal minorities, children who've been internally displaced, refugees, and out-of-school children. Our US-based headquarters is in Atlanta, but we have Federation members around the globe. Thanks for the introduction.
Great, thanks so much. By the way, folks, you can find, as always, you can find full bios in the chat, and they will be available in the materials that are posted after the session. I just didn't want to do long bios. Bridge, you're a literacy entrepreneur or social entrepreneur focused on literacy. You've got 2 organizations, you've got big ideas. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, hi, John. Hi, everyone. It's about almost 1 a.m. in India, so pardon me.
You're a good man for being with us. Thank you for being with us.
But at 1 a.m. In India, we make outlandish claims, and I'm going to make one today.
Excellent.
Excellent. My outlandish claim is that, well, you see my organization, Planet Read, and there's an initiative I founded called the Billion Readers Initiative. So my outlandish claim is, there goes. We are going to make 1 billion people read every day for 2 hours for 70 years. That is their lifespan. Okay, now you might all laugh at this, and I hope by the end of this webinar, I hope to convince most of you that actually this is realistic.
Fantastic. Bridge, let's stick with you for a sec now, and let's learn a little bit more about what you do other than stay up too late at night in order to make outlandish claims across the globe. Tell us a little bit about the same language subtitling that you have been working with.
Okay, so maybe we could just go to the next slide. And all right, this is the big challenge in India. Before the pandemic, if you just see children in grade 5, only about half the children able to read at grade 2 level. Okay, now it has dropped further during the and after the pandemic. So next slide, there's a massive reading problem that's there. So about 600 million people who are really extremely weak readers, even though they've gone to school. Now, television has made a significant presence in India, 1 billion plus viewers already. And the average viewing is about 3 hours and 43 minutes, and that's an industry number. And this is going to happen over a lifespan of 70 years. Next slide, please. So here's our same language subtitling initiative. And you might liken it to closed captioning, but let's just see the video. Go to the next slide. So what you just saw earlier was a person watching, or 1 billion people watching a Hindi film song in this case, and what they're hearing is exactly what they're reading word for word. You might call it closed captioning. It's slightly different, and we don't need to get into the nuance of that. But here's a bit of the evidence of what's happening here when 1 billion people are watching that content for 4 hours a day. It's that if you see the eye tracking, just a still from that here, you start seeing that when the subtitles are there in the same language, children, adults, they automatically try to read along. And you can see that in where their eyesight is. So next slide, please. And I don't have too much time to get into all the evidence, and we will share some of those links later. But just to give you a quick big picture, what we found is that children who went to school and then went home and got reading practice purely as a part of their entertainment viewing, the number of children who became good readers more than doubled, and that's the green zone. And the number of children who remained completely illiterate even after 5 years of education, that halved. That's the red zone that halved. So, and what you will see in the next slide is a testimonial from a rural. Yeah, go ahead, please. It's okay.
अच्छा
डबल देखने से याद हो जाता है एक बार देखने से.
So you could see that it's a great reinforcement of language skills as well as reading skills. Next slide, please. Okay, how much does it cost? Well, essentially, this is a $20 million project over 5 years. It's going to make 1 billion people read pretty much every day for life after that. It's a system change initiative, and it costs about 10 cents for a lifetime of reading to one person. That's it, not even 10 cents a year. It's flat 10 cents for a lifetime.
Okay, Bridge, that's insane. That's crazy, Bridge. Can you
just
say,
the final slide would be the next one. And just to say that this is not limited to India, and I wanted to just show you a sample of how this might work in other countries. So maybe just see this video.
Pata Pata is the name of a dance we do down Johannesburg way. Everybody starts to move as soon as Pata Pata starts to play.
And the next slide is the final slide, and that's just a testimonial from South Africa.
It's a good idea to put in a Xhosa song. When it is a Xhosa song, you can put in a Xhosa song. If it's in English, you can put in English. If it's a Zulu, you can put in a Zulu.
Why it is a good idea?
Because you want the people to understand what is the song is. If it's a Xhosa, to understand what is the meaning of this song. If it is English, what is the meaning of this song?
Who is it?
To make it people to understand. In Xhosa, in English, in Zulu.
Okay, thank you.
Bridge, let me ask you a question before we proceed. Can you, without getting too scientific and nerdy about it, can you break down a little bit what's going on? Why same language captioning works, or how it works?
Yeah, so
I mean, how it works to help people read, not technically how it works, but how does hearing and seeing at the same time help literacy? I think we're probably close to understanding it, but if you could close that gap, that would be a little helpful, I think.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, the associations between the sound and the text are getting reinforced almost as a subconscious process as you're watching television. You're not there to really learn how to read. You're there to get entertainment, and you want the song lyrics, and you want to follow the dialogue better. And in that space, a viewer is extremely relaxed. They're in an emotionally positive space. And those associations between sound and text are getting reinforced. And this is important because when somebody's struggling to read, it can be a little bit of a frustrating experience for them. And they might at some point say, this is too difficult. But here the answer to their reading challenge is almost integrated to a point where the feedback is instantaneous, and the experience is one of success. and not one of struggle, because you always feel like you're getting something out of this. And it meets people based on what they've chosen to watch, not based on, oh, here's some good educational content we want the world to watch. That's hard to do. But if they're anyway going to watch their soaps and movies and music videos, well, the reading part is just integrated into that.
Monroe, I gotta come to you because I know how much you think about stuff like this. How does that strike you? Does that ring the bell for you?
It does. So what I love about it is it's really hitting both parts of how our brain processes, language, as well as sort of the text. When I hear Bridge talking, I'm thinking about how the subtitling is helping to reinforce orthographic mapping, right, of the text, right, and there's also been good research and evidence around subtitling for years. What's exciting is to see Bridge actually doing it at scale. I love that idea of 10 cents for a lifetime. I don't know if you can get a better deal than that, Bridge. But I think it's a great example of how innovation around learning, education is not limited by border. And some of the most delightful things can happen in many different parts of the world, where and we have to look for them sometimes, right? So I'm excited for this conversation today because I think there's so much we can learn from Bridge and the other panelists today here in the U.S. And my hope is that it runs in both directions as well.
Fantastic. Bob Wise, I know your eyes were popping out when Bridge was talking about it the other day, but now you saw it and you've spent so much time thinking about education, early education, literacy in all the different jobs you've had. We're going to get into our regular conversation in a sec. I just wanted to check in with you and see what your reaction to what you just saw and heard was.
Well, my reaction is that what Bridge has done very effectively is he's taken science and he's been able to move it very effectively into implementation, which is part of what the organization I work with, GSOLN, seeks to do. And if you're reaching 1 billion people, and the other part of it that Bridge has done is speaking as a former policymaker, what I've observed about policymakers, and I say this with the greatest respect, is that they respond a great deal to visual images. I can take all tomes of research into making an argument in front of a policymaker anywhere in the world, but they have very limited time. And what Bridge has done is he has a very concrete example that shows what can be done, the multimedia approach, and at the same time then can back it up with the science that's behind it that justifies. And so what is it that a policymaker, a legislator, an executive of a city, county, state, nation, province, what is it that that policymaker can do then to further leverage what Bridge is doing?
Great. Thanks so much, Bridge. That was a fabulous presentation and really helped us understand what you're doing. And I think we're all sort of collectively, individually and collectively gobsmacked by the 10 cents, per person for a lifetime. That is fantastic. So I wanted to just take us through a little arc of where you think we were on early childhood learning and development, early school success, in the domains in which you work before the pandemic. And Bridge, you already did that for India, for your population. Then I want to go to what happened during the height of the pandemic and just to mark and understand all the disruptions that we all experienced and how those affected children and young people and their learning and development. And then I want to talk about, okay, so what's everybody doing about it? And then to Monroe's earlier comment, also think about where we're looking in the future, not just at this immediate response, but how do we think about what's happening globally in the future? So, Catherine, I want to come back to you for a sec here and get your impression or your articulation of where you think things stood in the places where CARE is active, in these troubled regions and remote regions before the pandemic, specifically with respect to early childhood learning and development.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. In humanitarian developing settings where CARE works, pre-pandemic, we did see some progress being made in improving learning and other education outcomes through improvements in teacher development approaches, helping teachers move away from teacher-directed learning which included rote memorization and copying off the board, to moving toward more student-centered approaches and using formative assessments or other ways to track learners' individual progress. This was particularly saw this at the primary grade level, particularly lower primary. Mm-hmm. And this was especially among marginalized groups, such as children with disabilities and children who are out of school. We also saw an increased focus on being more clear about what barriers exist and which ones need to be addressed to improve gender equity and equality and social inclusion through the integration of social and behavioral change interventions. There were also some improvements in collecting of disaggregated data about students to help better identify the learners most in need and schools most in need, as well as in having conversations with ministries of education and school governance bodies about how to monitor data to better understand what's working in terms of teachers' teaching practices and students' learning, particularly in middle-income countries, and CARE does work in some of those.
Yep.
There has also been progress made pre-pandemic to exploring the meaningful use of EdTech to support learning and to increase education access, and also to support continuous professional development for teachers and teacher educators.
Okay, great. Bob, snapshot. Where were we in February 2020 in terms of global interest and acceptance and adoption of the science of learning?
As Catherine notes, I think we were moving there, but we still had something somewhere the World Bank estimates 53 to 57% of children at the age of 10 not reading at anywhere near a proficient level, not able to understand a basic text. And after the pandemic, that's at 70%. Let's think about what the situation was. You said February. Let me take it to March.
All right.
When the pandemic was fully in effect, we had across the globe, we had 190 countries closing schools for at least 2 weeks or more, some of them up to a year and a half. We had 1.5 billion students out of schools, 66 million teachers. And then you also had all the whatever gains some had been able to make, strongly challenged, because now children that perhaps were benefiting from an in-school setting are now technology is the only way to reach them in many areas where the technology either doesn't exist or is inadequate. And so what we did you can see it whether you're looking at US National Assessment of Education Progress scores or almost across the globe, you can see setbacks. And so it was a challenge before. But as a friend of mine says at the OECD, what that did though, John, was it created for the first time, there's a common experience. For a very brief time, we all were out of school. Now, I understand different situations for different people.
Yeah, no,
but schools were closed. We learned the value of teacher. We learned the importance of technology. We learned the importance of child care, child support, and also what is effective pedagogy, particularly when dealing with this situation. I have an alliterative device for how I viewed what happened. We're going through 3 stages right now. First is triage, and that's where you deal with the immediate problem. The world actually has been in triage for about 2 years. And now that you move to transition, how do you get back to something? But most folks don't want to go back to normal. So the third triage is, then can you get to transformation? And in literacy, can we truly take what we learned from COVID, both good and bad, and apply it such that we can strongly raise those that percentage?
Yep. Great. I want to, obviously, we're coming back to that, and we're going to talk about what happened in the pandemic and what those disruptions were. Before we do that, Monroe, I'd love to hear how you characterize sort of the arc of progress. Where were we making real gains in the States? And you could talk about the States in general, you could talk about Charlotte. And where did we see stuck places before the pandemic, like early March, not mid-March, but early March 2020? How would you characterize where we were?
Well, it's interesting, John, when you think about sort of particularly for early literacy, sort of the arc of the conversation that was beginning to happen around the science of reading. And if you think about Emily Hanford's sort of podcast, I think the first one came out in 2018. I've actually looked at previously the Google Trend data to see what people were looking, how were people searching for science of reading. So I think the first podcast came out in 2018. You saw a little spike and it went back down. And then the second podcast, I believe, came out in 2019 and it went up and it never came down. And so you sort of had this burgeoning interest. And then you had the pandemic hit, the US shores at least, and and things started to shut down in March 2020. And then the other thing I think that happened was that whereas teaching and children's learning was remote for a lot of people, when their instruction became remote, it became very close for a lot of people that were at home with their children. And I think a lot of people got to see that and had more empathy for what was happening, while at the same time that teachers were trying to teach remotely in a very unprecedented manner. And so you had these sort of connections or confluence between a greater focus on what is the science telling us about reading and reading instruction and how children learn to read. You had the focus on obviously supporting children through the pandemic. And those two things have come together, I think, in very, very interesting ways, sort of amplified by the work of Emily Hanford. Nicholas Kristof has written some interesting things. You have the Right to Read documentary is out. And so it feels like you have a greater sort of focus on this topic. Obviously, the results from Mississippi, their NAEP scores came out. So all of that sort of came at the same time when the focus on helping, looking at what the impact of closing schools was going to be on children. And so you have, I think I'm not quite sure how to describe where we're at on the other side of the height of the pandemic. Yep. It's not over.
Yep. Of course. Right.
But you have sort of this now sort of groundswell of folks that are talking more about the science of reading, asking about what's effective. I follow literacy Twitter. So it's really interesting to see what the conversations are today about this as compared to 3 or 4 years ago. So lots of interest in this topic. Obviously, more states adopting and enacting laws and policies around this. The Schenker Institute just put out a report just the other day about state policies regarding early literacy. So at least for the topic of early literacy, it feels like our moment to sort of not to galvanize sort of the focus on this topic. As Rahm Emanuel supposedly has famously said to not let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah, of course, right.
And to really grab this moment to sort of push the work forward. The challenge, of course, is that we had disparities and inequities before the pandemic.
Yep.
The pandemic really laid those bare. And I would say, at least in Charlotte, North Carolina, what's sort of interesting is that when we look at how the pandemic impacted third grade scores by subgroups and at the school level, we see a wider disbursement of children that were negatively impacted based on their test scores for the last 2 years. When I look at school level data, there are schools that we used to not worry about on a relative basis that now you're worried about because they have lower scores than, in the entire 8 years that I've been here. Obviously, those children didn't get regular instruction. And, there's just, once again, as someone said earlier, laid bare the truth that going to school every day matters. And when you take that away, we have this huge natural unwanted, experiment, but it really demonstrated that, schooling matters. So I think the question is, what do we do now? What do we know that can help the children that were, in school when this happened? How do we help them catch up and accelerate? But we also have, and as I said, the pandemic is not over. Yep. We're hearing from our colleagues that work in the birth to 5 space that there are children, 2 and 3 year olds, with greater language delays and cognitive delays than prior to the pandemic, higher levels.
Yep.
Those children will be in elementary school in a few years. So we have work on both sides of the birth to 5 K3 divide, and that's not to speak of grades 4 and higher that were also impacted as well. So if ever there is a time we need a science of learning to help guide us, this is the moment.
Catherine, I want to come back to you to talk a little bit about your observations about what happened during the pandemic and during the height of the pandemic, because I don't want to pretend like it's over. I know too many people have COVID right now. Yeah. But at the height of the pandemic, yes, people, what Monroe said, what others said, people were out of school, kids were out of school for a long time, but all kinds of other stuff happened that has a big effect on people's ability to learn. Talk a little bit about that. Then we'll have, I think, the baseline here, and we can go into responses, including what Bridge is doing in India. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, how many minutes do we have? There's just so much I could say.
Not so many.
I know.
Let's just tick off some of the things that we've talked about before.
Yeah. As I was listening to some of my fellow panelists, one thing that I wanted to emphasize is the role of mental health and some of the increases in anxiety and the depression that were not just, I'm sure not just prevalent in the US, but also in the context in which care works. And the implications of that on children's ability to learn, the social isolation, the need to be among peers or within communities as part of their learning experience. But in addition to that, in many of the countries where care works, the pandemic was just one of many conflicts and crises that have been going on and that have been exacerbated. And we're talking about the ravages of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, prolonged drought, the impact of that on agriculture production and livelihoods, and the lack of access of nutritious protein-rich foods that affects students' ability to concentrate and focus. That's not a small thing when children are beginning to learn foundational skills, including sometimes a first or a second language. In addition to that, there was an escalation in protection issues for children during the pandemic in many of the countries where we were, including being separated from caregivers and having to take on increased caregiving burdens or economic engagement, forcing particularly girls to drop out of school and putting them at risk, depending on what kind of work that they were involved in outside the home. And that, of course, had dire implications for educational, economic, and health outcomes. And then governments were scrambling to identify the best ways to mitigate learning losses especially in the absence of having ed tech tools that were accessible and affordable. And for communities that didn't have access and don't even have basic services, what was the best way to ensure that children were continuing to be able to come to school? So I do want to emphasize the social dimensions of learning and the psychosocial needs that were escalated and exacerbated during the pandemic. I don't think that's a small thing.
Yeah, Bob Wise, I want to come to you on just that and the intersection of sort of science of learning in the sort of technical way and the intersection of that with mental health kind of issues. But Bridge, I want to come back to you because for a second here, what you've done is so interesting because I think most of us spend a lot of time thinking about how to influence big systems or create supports where big systems are failing to provide the kind of supports that people need when they're in tough circumstances. You skipped all that, seems like you just went to where people are. They're watching TV, whether there's a pandemic or not a pandemic. Maybe they're watching more TV because there's a pandemic. What made you jump the wall that way? Think about this in a completely different dimension. And do you have more ideas about how we could do more of that, embed more opportunities for learning in the things that we already do, rather than trying to improve systems or correct for systems that are failing?
Yeah, and so on the big system change that we're going for, we're really going after the entire entertainment industry as well, not just thinking of education as mostly government-led, and that is certainly the case. But we're also saying, hey, all the Netflixes of the world, Amazons of the world, you're sitting on content in all the languages and the world is just consuming it. And you have an opportunity to make a huge contribution by integrating same language subtitling in all your content in all the languages. Now, most people will say, well, doesn't it already exist in English? Yes, it does. So English is kind of taken care of, at least on streaming platforms, but Indian languages, not really, right? So we managed to persuade the Ministry of Information Broadcasting in India to pass a legislation that all on television, half the content, 50% of the entertainment content now is required to carry same language subtitling for 3 reasons. And here's where a confluence of very different forces, and this comment was already made in the chat box today. Accessibility, media accessibility is a huge deal. And we need to make that possible in 23 official languages. Okay. And then language learning. So all the research on captioning in the US actually has focused and centered, including in Europe, on language learning. And so we know that closed captioning helps with second language learning, foreign language learning, for even first language vocabulary acquisition. But somehow it escaped, I think the system in general, that this is actually good for reading skills as well. There are suggestions. I'm not saying that those haven't been made, but it's never been leveraged for that purpose. And then you asked a second question, which is that what else could we be doing? And here, let me give you an example where we're headed right now.
Great.
Okay, reading, we're doing it this way. Numeracy. It's well known that almost every child in India watches cricket, and maybe baseball could be the parallel in the US.
But it used
there's
to
a
be,
lot
no
of
more.
numeracy.
More.
Okay. So, but there's a lot of numeracy activity that is going on while you're watching cricket. Naturally, could we then, as people are watching live cricket matches, throw simple questions that relate to the context of the game, so that people then get engaged with it as an entertainment, but around math and numeracy? right? So that's where we're actually starting a new project.
Interesting. Great. Bob, I need you to answer about what Catherine talked about mental health, but you've thought so much about digital education and so forth through your career. I'm just curious again how you react to what Bridge is saying. Could all the stuff that kids watch in the States be same language captioned and subtitled? And do you think that would actually help develop reading skills and sort of and reading fluency and comfort, all those things that Bridge is talking about?
Well, I'm not sure I should answer that. Netflix stock has been dropping today sharply. I don't want to contribute to it. The in a serious note, so while I don't want to endorse everything that kids watch, because maybe there's too much being watched, and I do feel that what Bridge is talking about, absolutely, because let's recognize something, and this one's been established in the science of learning, and that is the human brain is not ordinary. The human brain does not normally gravitate to reading. I mean, as we developed as Homo sapiens, hunting became natural because we had to eat. We learned to communicate by grunting, but that we already had that innately in our brain. Reading is not a natural phenomenon. And so therefore, what is it you need to do to activate the brain? And that then leads to those connections being made for effective reading. Bridge is doing one of those things. He's activating portions of the brain because people are responding to something that interests them. And then in turn, that they're learning more about reading. The same process takes place in phonics, and where you activate certain portions of the brain. And so that's what I think is the important. How do you make a meaningful activation of the brain using the neuroscience that then leads to improved reading? And I do want to follow up on something that was just said about math and numeracy. We are fast learning across the world that there are lots of issues about numeracy and the science of learning and in the science. And so what I want to make sure doesn't happen is that we break out either numeracy or literacy. You've got the science of reading or you've got the science of math. Yes, but it's important to understand there's a correlation between the two in the science of learning, and that the brain, as it develops literacy, that can also provide a strong foundation for numeracy, and also vice versa. If you look at certain imaging and scans, brain scans, you can see the same areas light up with either what's good about in their learning, or you can see where there are problems, whether it's dyslexia or dyscalculia. And so Bridge, any way that you can get the brain and the human to engage, such as what Bridge is doing, can lead to improved literacy.
Great. Monroe, I want to ask you about what Catherine said about some of the things that are going on in young people's lives in the homes in which they live during the pandemic, and the impact that had on learning. It could go broadly under the category of mental health, but that seems like it's too broad. So talk a little bit about what you observed in Charlotte and its intersection with learning.
I'm glad Catherine brought this up, and Philip Evans in the chat also brought up this topic as well. I think one of the things that's important for all of us to remember is that just like for all of us, for children and families, there were some things that were in common in terms of how they experience the pandemic and the closing of schools, remote instruction, et cetera. But in other ways, there were very, very different experiences, right? For some children, learning absolutely stopped. I know from talking with colleagues here in Charlotte that there were some schools, particularly the highest poverty schools, where there was extremely low attendance during remote instruction. In other words, whatever challenges there may have been with remote, there were large percentages of children in some of the most schools that need the help that were attending remote instruction at the lowest levels. And so that certainly was a tremendous challenge. And so not everyone experienced it the same way. I know that there were efforts in our community and others to help and assist children. If you had, if your family, your parents, caregivers were deemed essential workers and had to be on the front lines, your experience is very different than if your parents were able to work at home. Even closer to home, in my own experience, I had 2 daughters in college, 1 in high school, and it took me about a month and a half to realize I needed to upgrade my internet because all of us were pulling on the internet at the same time and we didn't have enough bandwidth. We were fortunate enough to be able to manage that, but in other households, that was challenging. There were efforts in our community to provide access to computers, to internet access. And I think there's a greater awareness of digital equity issues, and there's work that continues on that, but we can't kid ourselves and believe that we solve that for everyone right away. In fact, one of the things that we ran into fairly early was our district had actually made a fair amount of early investments in sort of one-to-one technology. So when the pandemic hit, they had some infrastructure to pull on. The challenging part, it was actually for the youngest kids, I believe grades K2 or K3, they had the least amount of technology for those children. It was actually for the upper elementary and older kids that had that infrastructure. So they had to lean in and sort of figure that out, pretty quickly. The other thing I would just say on the, mental health issues, clearly we're hearing from our, from our schools, there have been a lot of issues around social-emotional development. The district here has poured more resources into that. They've looked at that in the context of the multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. But we certainly have heard higher levels of sort of behavioral issues, discipline issues. Even that first year of, when we were sort of back into classroom, I heard from principals who said it took them a whole quarter just to get things back to where they normally would have been at the beginning of the year in terms of routines. The last thing I'll say that's also important we shouldn't overlook are the staff, teachers, teaching assistants, others in instructional leaders. They went through this themselves. They had families of their own health, their own well-being being affected as well. I actually saw some research a few years back that actually was able to draw a clear connection between sort of a classroom teacher's own sort of socio-emotional health and the impact on reading outcomes. So the connection is real, and we certainly can't overlook the educators and others that we're working throughout to try to keep our educational system afloat.
Yeah, all good points. All right, so we're going to pivot out of the pandemic and think about what we think about where Hattie left us at the beginning. Okay, we want to accelerate learning recovery, and we want to accelerate learning in general. Bob talked about getting out of triage, getting back into, what was the second T, Bob?
Transition, and then
and then getting into transformation. And it feels like domestically we're seeing all of that at the same time. People in different places. Some people really trying to go towards transformation. Other people just trying to get back to where we were. But the point of this session is to hear about what's going on in other places to see if we can learn and find some inspiration and energy there. Catherine, I want to come to you to start with about what you've seen in a couple of places around the globe in terms of responding to the needs, the learning and development needs of young kids coming out of this pandemic.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to ask a question about your question. Are you asking me what worked particularly well that we can
Yeah.
put forward?
What are you seeing that you think is working well and suggest, oh, these are smart investments, these are good investments? I mean, we've had a couple of reports from World Bank and so forth, and Sarah, maybe you can post those in the chat about, here are the highest value bets, here are sort of medium value, here's, I don't know so much if you really want to do that, if you have money. What have you seen, Catherine, that gives you energy and optimism about something that looks a little bit like transformation to accelerate learning recovery and then continue to accelerate learning going forward?
Okay, I'll try to mention three very quickly.
Great.
Everyone on this panel knows that I was an educator for over 20 years prior to becoming an international development practitioner. So my heart remains with teachers and supporting teachers. So I think critically investing in a variety of different approaches to support teacher development, which can include a combination of, virtual learning, teaching and learning, where those tools are not cost prohibitive, and ensuring that they're used safely and responsibly to support teachers and teacher educators has paid off in rich dividends in many of the countries where we work. For example, in Zimbabwe and Somalia, many of our teachers and Ministry of Education coaches participated or created communities of practice or teacher learning circles, where they had mobile phones that had these options to engage in WhatsApp groups and to teleconference and share materials and screenshots of their lesson plans, and to receive feedback and ongoing support as they endeavored to try to support children, either who are learning virtually, or for many of our kids where care works, they didn't have access to ed tech whatsoever. So we had to depend on developing and revising and updating home-based learning materials. Another important aspect of that work was ensuring that guidance was provided and ongoing mentoring and coaching and support to learners and caregivers. Many of our caregivers are illiterate or low literate, on how to support self-directed study at home, and had to do that with the support of the community, not just with members of the household, while in the pandemic adhering to social distancing norms. And then as we get through the pandemic and cases are dropping, to support the use of small groups or community learning centers to support learners. Mm-hmm. And then I would say that many of the communities where we work came up with very innovative solutions, which were spearheaded by local governance structures, whether they be school management committees or mothers groups or PTAs, parent-teacher associations, and really leveraging and utilizing them to help support coming up with everything from identifying safe spaces for children to learn to how to follow up on children who, when schools reopened, did not return to school, to motivate them or find out the reasons why they were not attending, and to identify other kinds of solutions to support the active engagement in the community and local governance structures to support learners, and to see that education is not just the responsibility of the Ministry of Education or teachers or schools. It must be owned. The ability of children to learn should be owned by communities themselves. And we had a lot of success around the globe in promoting opportunities for communities to become more actively engaged in Somalia, Cambodia, Malawi. I could go on and on. So those are just three of the.
That's really helpful. Bridge, I'm curious, Bob, I'm coming to you in just a sec, but I'm curious whether you saw in India an uptick in energy around the work that you're doing because of the concern that it seems broadly shared about lost learning during the pandemic. Did this inject a new sense of urgency, not just to you, so that you're up at 1:45 in the morning or whatever it is now, but broadly speaking, and therefore created circumstances in which, an environment in which people were really especially interested in what you're doing?
So there has been an uptick generally in doing something about foundational literacy and numeracy, and that's already in the national education policy, but that actually predates the pandemic as well. But the pandemic really, brought to the fore, like, this was, what do we do when schools are closed, right?
Yep.
Interestingly, and Abhijit Banerjee makes this point, that actually even before the pandemic, 200 days of schooling, children attended roughly about 100. So intermittent schooling was always a reality. So one thing that is at least a learning for me personally has been that the solutions that were maturing and being well researched before the pandemic for almost a decade or two were the solutions actually ended up being very useful during the pandemic. And I'm talking about teaching at the right level. Now, that the pandemic didn't give birth to that. It was there before, but the pandemic now brings that to its importance to the fore. Same thing with us. We've been working at this for about 3 decades now, roughly. This solution, unbelievable as it might seem, but that's what it took, the pandemic, to finally say, okay, well, if during the pandemic people watched more TV, actually we could have maintained for all 250 million children a continuing rise in their reading skills, etc. Right? So the sad part, and I do want to caution policymakers as well, is that what a lot of states did is that they started a dedicated television channel for literally creating a classroom content and beaming it on television and hoping that children will consume it. It really doesn't work like that, and it didn't really work like that. So it was, and yet that's what has caught the imagination of policymakers right now. So right now, 200 dedicated TV channels are actually have been launched for education, one for each grade in 23 languages. And they have now, what will be the content? Who will consume it? Is it impactful? All of those questions remain. So unfortunately, sometimes there's a misunderstanding that TV is the solution. It's not. It's the passion. It's the solution. Like what children had passion for. Now, can we harness that? And so sometimes the point is missed about what's the innovation in many of these innovations.
Yeah, interesting. Bob, it strikes me there's some similarities there with science of reading, science of learning, like it existed before the pandemic. There was an uptick. How do you think about what the pandemic and the concern about learning did to accelerate the uptake of the science of learning across the globe? And if you have some, if you have some examples of that would be instructive, that would be helpful.
Well, what it did was, once again, I understand all the differences that everybody's situation across the globe as the school shut down, but it did provide a common, and one person said to me, a common laboratory, in the sense of schools are shut down, teachers are out. Yeah. And so what can we glean from this? What can we learn from a somewhat common experience? One thing that, so I want to actually go to, I'm speaking as a former politician, I'm going to probably ignore your question and go answer the one I really wanted to.
I'm shocked, but shocked.
It's more like what Bridge says, is that, that you can put up information that's not very helpful, or you can actually try to deliver what you want. Anyway, so what I think, but it does get to you, John. One of the things that happened, and I know because of some of the work that I sit on the University of California, San Francisco's Dyslexia Centers Advisory Board. And one of the things that happened, and not just at UCSF, but in other researchers across the world, is the neuroscience research kept going. And some of it actually began to, I think, pick up on what was happening with COVID. The result is this, and it goes to something Bridge talked about. The neuroscience was very clear. It showed that we're beginning to see the development of digital screeners for reading readiness that can be applied as early as pre-K to grade 1 or 2. That should also be language sensitive, so that in a student who speaks Spanish as the first language, you don't just screen them with the English screener, but it's adapted to their particular learning, that the way they process. In California, the screeners that they're working on right now, besides English, are Spanish and Mandarin, those being 2 of the largest populations. So the science is the digital screener and determining what challenges a student may have, what strengths. But then that goes to something that, Bridget, I know you're doing in India and others are, teaching at the right level. We need to be identifying and not just putting students in grade level and then saying, how do we catch them up to their grade level, but what level are they actually at right now? And then what do you need to adapt to help them move along, and whether it's so-called catching up or getting to the level that you want. So combining the neuroscience that tells us it can be done and it can help measure, and then the practical application that we're seeing in India, Gambia, Ghana, and other parts of the world of teaching at the right level. That's to me the perfect matching up.
Thanks, Bob. I want to say to everybody who's watching, we'd love to have your questions. If you put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, we'll see them there and we'll post them to our guest. Monroe, I got to ask you, what's going on now? I see neurons bouncing around inside your head. What are you thinking about I know how active you've been in looking outside the US for ideas and inspiration. You're hearing some stuff from Bridge about India, some ideas that are popping in Africa and South America. What's coming up for you?
Well, John, I get excited every time someone talks about teaching at the right level. I don't know how, but YouTube knows me. It knows what I do for a living. And I saw a video in December of 2021 about how to teach, a child to read in 50 days. And I must have watched that thing 10 times in a row and I was crying. And I'm serious. And what I was amazed by, I'd been at this work for 6 or 7 years, and how I'd never heard of Protham, and how I'd never heard about teaching at the right level. And so I've been following this for the last year and a half. I've read all the studies and the folks at JPAL, but also, I follow teaching at the right level in Africa on Twitter and LinkedIn. And, I think it's sort of interesting because there's some really powerful work that started in India that's spreading across the African continent, multiple countries. And I sort of look at this, I think, sort of totally artificial divide between our conversation about high dosage tutoring and what is happening overseas. And it's an example of where, if I think about Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We need to tear down this wall for early literacy. There is amazing work happening outside the US that we could benefit from. The Taro model has some very interesting aspects. One, they've shown it can work with community members. They've shown that it can work for children in grades 3 to 5. We have a lot of children that need to help catch up and accelerate. In fact, in some countries and on the African continent, they call it catch up, right? So I think there's places for us to learn, and it's one example, right? We've got a couple of other examples, really nice evidence-based strategies or interventions that I think we could learn from in the US. there is, JPAL had a write-up, I guess sometime in the last year and a half, about a really compelling family engagement intervention in France that showed positive impacts on student outcomes. And, sort of in what we would call Title I schools here that it was spread. More people here need to know about it, that there's an evidence-based model for family engagement that is spread all across France now that we don't know about here in the United States. And then I would say, also we look at how do they teach reading and phonics in other parts of the English-speaking world. And, we often talk about phonics, but a lot of people don't know there's not just one way to do it. And so we've been tracking for the last 5 years, how do they teach reading in the UK and Australia and New Zealand? And here in Charlotte are experimenting with sort of the approach they take called synthetic phonics around how can we help rapidly accelerate children's word reading skills. Again, this is something that we learned from overseas. And I think if there are ways to accelerate that learning, it would be very helpful for us in our community. And lastly, John, since you gave me a little bit of airtime, I did.
I always love to hear what everybody
I'd like to make a plug. I give Emily Hanford lots of credit for elevating the conversation around evidence as it relates to literacy. But I want to give a plug for an amazing new book. Can you see this? Yep. It's an edited volume, The Handbook on the Science of Early Literacy, published earlier this year edited by Sonia Cabell, Susan Newman, and Nicole Patton-Terry. It is amazing. My entire team is reading it, but I think this frame of the science of early literacy is important because it elevates and gives equal standing, which is what the research tells us, the best evidence of listening comprehension and reading comprehension. Catherine and I were also sharing in the Q&A chat that oral language and listening comprehension don't get sort of the level of equal treatment that they should have. But let me just tell you, the best science we have, and particularly looking at what came out of the Reading for Understanding initiative, which I would say I think has been grossly overlooked in the field by practitioners, is that once a child learns to decode, it's listening comprehension that predicts reading comprehension. Listening comprehension becomes a leading predictor of reading comprehension. And so I think there is another element to this that's really important and helpful that can help all of us. And, there's important work that's happening, not just in the US, but elsewhere. The researchers talk to each other across the world all the time. Yep. It's time for us practitioners to do the same thing too.
Great pitch. So, wow, that was like, okay, so the listening and the reading comprehension just takes me right back to Bridge. Like, oh, that's what's happening, right? You're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're understanding it all at the same time. Bob, it's funny to see you in the role of like Ask Mr. Science, Bob Wise, but this must be music to your ears.
A lot of people find it a bit ironic.
Indeed. Yeah, not to mention your teachers. This must be music to your ears, what Monroe is saying here about the science of early literacy.
Yes, it is. But he also made me stimulated something else, which is, first of all, as Monroe said and others, it's important for those of us in the US to be willing to understand the importance of looking abroad, and seeing practical application. But I also think that we ought to recognize that there is a lot of good research that's been done in the US. There's a lot of good research being done in other parts of the world, but there is a lot of good research. The National Science Foundation, which actually works in a global capacity on education research and these issues. So a lot of good research has been done, but I'm still remembering what at least one, if not two ministers of education have told me from other countries. They look at me and they smile and they say, you all do great research. But the difference is that here we take your research and we apply it, but we apply it in a consistent way and we keep applying it, as opposed to in the US, you tend to take research, develop something, use it for a year or two, and then move on to something else. And so I think that it is important that we recognize the importance of consistent application of research wherever good research, wherever it's coming from, and make sure we do. Once again, I'm all about knowledge brokering. I'm not the scientist. I hope that I can be the bridge, though, or the organization, to be the bridge between the science and getting it implemented by the teacher, the educator, and the policymaker. And just remember, coming out of COVID, right now, there are critical education decisions being made across the world that will affect generations of children, both in response to COVID, but also how do we do better. This is a vitally important time for science to be informing literacy as well as other areas of education.
Totally agree. Bridge, I want to come to you in a moment, but Catherine's wanted to lob something in. Go ahead, Catherine. Yeah, you're on mute. You're on mute. Had to happen.
Of course, it's going to be me doing it. Don't forget that many learners in the US and other parts of the world do not speak the national language of instruction. So a focus on growing teacher skill set in how to promote biliteracy or multiliteracy is essential. And oral language development and listening comprehension are often missed skills in that area. How to use the storytellers at home and the communities to help grow children's ability to bridge from the mother tongue, which is sometimes they speak more than one at home, by the way, to what they learn in the classroom. And while people focus on the developing world as suffering from malnutrition and problems like that, there is pervasive malnutrition and health issues that prevail in many of the communities around the US. And that definitely has an effect on children's ability. It creates attentional deficits, ability to concentrate, to focus. And that is particularly problematic when children are trying to learn the foundational skills, both in literacy and numeracy. And literacy, kids need literacy to learn some of the foundational skills of numeracy. So it's not just affecting their ability to learn language and literacy skills, but also other skills, particularly in other subjects like numeracy. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Bridge, we were just talking about having a more synthetic approach to thinking about where we get inputs, where we get evidence, where we look for models. And what did Monroe say, tear down this wall? You told us when we talked the other day about how some of the synthetic, the simultaneous, same language translation happens, and how global even the development of this idea is. I think people would like to hear that because I think it's an interesting model. It's not like, oh, something was developed someplace else and we just bring it here. It's kind of developed everywhere. Go ahead, tell us that story if you would.
Sure. So clearly closed captioning was innovated in the US in the 70s and implemented in the 80s as far back as that. So clearly that innovation has been there and has spread to English speaking countries. It has not spread to majority non-English speaking countries, I should say. Okay. And the experience that I had was I went to the US as a student. I wanted to learn Spanish, and I used to watch Spanish films to learn Spanish, and they all came with English subtitles at the time. These are the VHS tapes, right? Mm-hmm. And there was no other option. There was no Spanish on Spanish I could find. And that was the genesis of that personal experience that, oh, why don't they just put Spanish on Spanish? And I can grasp the vocabulary, grasp the listening comprehension was emphasized, and that would perhaps help me learn the language. And then, of course, it was like, oh, okay, maybe something like this could help with reading and literacy in India. And to my surprise, not that much research had been done, which seems like such an obvious solution, right, at some level.
Yeah.
And then in India, it took 30 years to kind of try to build that case that, yeah, it can work. But meanwhile, there's a professor in Belgium, I found out, has done some very sophisticated eye tracking studies to prove that when somebody watches content with captioning, which is in the same language, they try to engage with the text automatically. So they cannot but try to read along. It's a proven scientific fact.
That's so interesting, yeah.
And yet that was proven with good readers. So then the question was, well, would an early reader and a weak reader also experience that natural engagement, automatic subconscious engagement? And so we did this eye tracking study, basically replicating what he did with readers in the remote parts of Rajasthan. And, you know, we could take an eye tracker there. So clearly the US, Belgium, other eye trackers around the world are contributing to this. And so we're just building another layer to it. And leveraging the passion that already exists. And I think if we want to think of our innovation, probably it's that we're really trying to marry an educational outcome to the mass passion that already exists. And so our goal is always go look for the passion first, and then think of what can you do with that passion and redirect it towards perhaps an educational outcome that we have.
Bridge, there's our survey. So those who are still with us, please fill out the survey. It's extremely helpful to us, and we'll just continue our conversation. Both what Catherine said and what Bridge said about innovation happening all over the place. I really want to hear from Bob and from Monroe, like, what can we do in the States to get better at paying attention to things that are happening globally, to do this kind of integration, to think more seamlessly? Monroe, I'll come to you first, Monroe. You've been doing this on your own, trying to figure it out, learning all kinds of stuff, bringing it to people in Charlotte. Do you have to white label it? Do you have to pretend that you didn't learn it someplace else, or does it help you? And what have you learned about how learnings from other places and models from other places might be applied here that makes it go down okay in a country that kind of sometimes likes its own stuff?
That's a great question, John. One thing I think that would help both us and campaign communities across the entire GLR network is to reduce the cost of search. I happen to either see a YouTube video promoted to me, or I'm on JPAL's email list, and so happen to read something about a family engagement model. If there were ways for us to learn together, honestly, I'm so glad, because I got to learn about Bridge and his work today. And as much as I scour, this is my first opportunity to learn about Bridge and his important work that's happening in India. So ways that could reduce a lot the cost of search, I think it would be helpful. I think also, similar to what Catherine was suggesting, if we can help make the connections between our populations here, because we have multiple populations in the US, and how that relates outside of the US, I think that would be helpful. I was saying when we were all sort of meeting earlier, one of my favorite books around evaluation is called Real World Evaluation. And I think some of the most creative entrepreneurial evaluators are doing work outside the US. And the subtitle in the book is Working Under Budget, Time, Data, and Political Constraints. Well, if that doesn't describe all of us, right? And so I think there's so much that we can learn from so many other places, and vice versa. And so I think if we could reduce the cost of search, that would be helpful. I have found so far, maybe it's a little bit mixed with our own, whatever credibility we have in Charlotte, that people have been open. Now I had to do a little bit of explaining about TARL and Pratham and how it can translate. And I have to explain, well, yes, they did it in Hindi. This is how we could do it in English. But I do think that folks, can be open to learning about how things work in other places, especially if there's evidence behind it.
Thanks. Hattie, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I actually want to give Governor Wise the last word. With all your different hats on, Bob, all the different places you've sat and places you've tried to lead, talk about some of what Monroe just said. You said it earlier that we got to figure out how to get better at learning from other places. How can that happen? What's going to help make that happen?
So I actually want to answer your question now, John.
Yes, I win.
So Monroe and others, it's two things I think are important. I've spent a lot of time, particularly when I was leading an education nonprofit, trying to make international comparisons and getting people to understand what happens in Singapore, what happens in Finland, wherever we're studying. And what I learned was this: don't try to sell it as this is good for the U.S. as a country, because a lot of times people say, well, we're a nation of 350 million. I know, paltry British compared to India, but we're a nation of 350 million, very diverse. So what someone is doing in another very small country of 5 million or 10 million doesn't relate. But half our states in the United States are about that size. And so take it to the state and local level and say, how does this teaching system, for instance, in Singapore relate? That's number one. And number two is, we haven't talked about, because it's been such a rich discussion, but to me, all of the importance of all of this basically gets down to teacher preparation and professional learning for teachers. And so how do we take the science of learning? How do we take the best practices that are across the world and infuse them into the teacher preparation programs in our country, any country really, in our country, and particularly in the professional learning? And that's I think a real challenge for us, because while we have a generation of teachers coming through existing teacher preparation programs, at the same time we have 2 or 3 generations of teachers that are already in the classroom, and we need to be able to make sure and get to them and use our professional development dollars and processes much more effectively than we are. But it's about the teacher and the preparation and development.
Well, that's interesting, because that's exactly where Catherine went when she talked about some of the most interesting practices she saw in places that we would think are unlikely, Zimbabwe or Somalia. We might not think to look there, but you're bringing that really back together really nicely. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you, to Bridge, to Governor Wise, Bob, Monroe, and Catherine for helping us begin to think about this. And Monroe, I think you subtly, not subtly, laid down a little challenge for the campaign, for all of us, that we can learn together, reduce the cost of search, make this fun, engaging, and sort of a communal exploration. And I think all of you gave us hints about how we could move just from learning about these things to actually adopting some of them, at least testing some of them. Bridge, a million billion thanks for staying up so late to talk with us. It is wonderful to be with you. We're so impressed with what you've done and inspired by your work, and just grateful for your dedication that you'd stay up till the middle of the night to talk to a bunch of Americans who are curious about all of this. So blessings to you, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm going to turn it back to Hattie to close us out.
Thank you all. Thanks to everybody who joined us for this conversation today, and also to all of our speakers. It's been a really inspiring conversation, and I'm hopeful that we will all continue to think about and reflect on and look outside of the US to figure out where else we can innovate in academic recovery post-pandemic. Well, almost not quite post-pandemic, but as we're transitioning out of the pandemic. As a reminder, I just wanted to let all of our audience members know about our upcoming webinars. We have a great rebroadcast schedule set up for the rest of July and August, and we hope that you'll join us for some of these sessions that we've been wanting to re-highlight this fall. Thanks again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day or evening for Bridge.
Thanks.
Thank you.